You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 360, recorded on Sunday, March 21st, 2021. I'm your host, Rachel, and I am recording from my house in Boise, Idaho. This episode is about Frank Church, who was the last Democratic senator from Idaho. He is famous for his investigations into the misdeeds of multinational corporations and the intelligence community. I wanted to talk about him because Idaho is seen as a Republican stronghold, but I wanted to highlight his popularity, as well as his four-term tenure as U.S. Senator, which is one of the longest tenures for a U.S. Senator from Idaho. The research for this episode came from the extremely well-researched and well-sourced Fighting the Odds, The Life of Senator Frank Church by Leroy Ashby and Rod Grammer, published in 1994 by WSU Press. Frank Church was born July 25, 1924, in Boise, Idaho. He was a precocious youth, writing a letter to the editor urging the U.S. to stay out of the war in Europe at age 14, and he competed nationally in oratory. He always knew he would go into politics, and he admired William E. Borah, who was the U.S. Senator from Idaho from 1907 to 1940. Although his father was a Republican small business owner, Church became a Democrat after FDR visited Boise in 1938. After Pearl Harbor, Church rethought his isolationist stance and vowed to enlist in World War II, which he did after attending Stanford for 2 quarters. Church ended up in intelligence in the Asian theater of combat, mostly in India and China, where he analyzed Japanese troop movement. While he was in Asia, he saw firsthand the effects of colonialism, which deepened his disdain for imperialism, and he was concerned about the U.S. launching its own imperialistic program to maintain wartime levels of productivity and employment. After the war, he graduated from Stanford, and then he got a law degree from Stanford as well. He returned to Idaho and worked as a lawyer until he decided to run for Idaho legislature in 1952. He lost terribly, placing 5th in a field of 8 candidates. After that election, he worked on changing the Idaho Democratic Party, centered in Ada County, until he ran for U.S. Senate in 1956. The elders of the party worried that he was too green to win a statewide office, but he heavily canvassed the state and won, beating arch-conservative Herman Welker. Once he was in office, he quickly made a name for himself, helping to get the Civil Rights Act of 1957 passed. This earned him the favor of Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Baines Johnson, who put him on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in 1959, like his hero Borah was. He also worked on statehood for Alaska and Hawaii in 1958 and 1959. From the very beginning of his Senate tenure, he opposed secrecy surrounding military assistance in Latin America. However, he was not immune to Cold War saber rattling, giving speeches warning of Russia's spreading communism in Africa and Asia. However, as I said before, he opposed imperialism, so he endorsed encouraging domestic reforms to fight communism, rather than propping up American-friendly dictators. In the 60s, he endorsed JFK over LBJ at the 1960 Democratic National Convention, which kind of hurt LBJ and kind of soured him on Church in later years. Church praised JFK's positive new policy toward Africa, but he was unaware that the CIA was taking covert action against Patrice Lumumba, and he saw anti-colonialism as a way to foster independence in Africa while fighting communism's encroachment on the continent. Church was concerned that the Cold War rhetoric allied the U.S. with dictators such as the Shah in Iran, and domestically he embraced, quote, a new birth of liberalism. He wanted the government to protect citizens from economic hardship and ensure fairness in the market, where small businesses could compete against corporations. Church also emerged as a wilderness conservationist. He tried to pass a wilderness bill in 1961 and 1962. This passed the Senate but died in the House. This wilderness bill provided opposition fodder for his re-election campaign in 1962. However, he won with almost 55% of the vote, again by canvassing the state and drumming up popularity for his campaign. In the early 60s, the conditions in South Vietnam under the government of Ngo Dinh Diem were bad, and he had misgivings about South Vietnam. but he felt he had to balance that with his support for JFK. After Diem's assassination, he got concerned that the U.S. was getting pulled into the conflict between North and South Vietnam. After JFK's assassination, Lyndon Baines Johnson wanted to look tough in Vietnam to hold Russia and China at bay, but he also wanted to work on his Great Society project at home, and sentiment at the time was against interfering in Vietnam. However, the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964 really changed the equation. Church threw his support behind LBJ and backed a lot of those Great Society reforms, and he felt he had to support LBJ in entering the conflict in Vietnam. However, he later came to regret his decision. The fear of a Goldwater presidency led to Church backing LBJ more than he felt was prudent later on. During LBJ's administration, Church really tried to find the middle ground between speaking out as an anti-war senator while still trying to support the presidency against a rising right wing. But this strategy largely failed, and Church ended up voting for funding bills for the U.S. to, quote, honor their commitments in Vietnam. But this really just led to further expansion into Vietnam. And this also really damaged his reputation amongst his fellow anti-war doves. He was really seen as a tool of the administration who could be manipulated to vote the way LBJ wanted him to. In 1969, his anti-war stance caused an attempted recall campaign, but this really only strengthened his popularity in Idaho. The money for the recall came from out-of-state members of the John Birch Society, the ultra-right-wing group, and this out-of-state money really raised the hackles of fiercely independent Idahoans. So he really kind of came out on top. Church could spin this outside interference into his favor, and he won his 1968 re-election with 60% of the vote. After Nixon won the presidential campaign in 1968, Church was able to come out stronger against the war in Vietnam, but he really had to contend with a strong executive branch. Nixon really wasn't interested in listening to what the legislative branch really had to say, and he was prepared to pretty much bulldoze over their concerns, really. So in the 70s, Church worked on a series of anti-Vietnam War amendments, starting with the Cooper-Church amendments. In December 1969, the Senate passed the first of a series of Cooper-Church amendments. This first one prohibited the use of American combat troops in Laos or Thailand. However, the Nixon administration just basically started a bombing campaign and kind of used that lack of troops on the ground loophole in their own favor. In 1970, Cooper and Church tried to pass further amendments attached to the Foreign Military Sales Act of 1971. These amendments included ending funding for maintaining ground troops in Cambodia and Laos after June 30th, 1970, banning air operations in Cambodia in support of Cambodian forces without congressional approval, and ending American support for Republic of Vietnam forces outside of territorial South Vietnam. These amendments passed the Senate but failed in the House, and Nixon threatened to veto the bill if it contained the amendments. A version of the bill without the Cooper-Church amendments later passed. A later version of the amendments, with the ban on air operations in Cambodia taken out, passed. These amendments were attached to the Foreign Aid Authorization Bill of 1970. Later, after Cooper didn't seek re-election, Church teamed up with Senator Case of New Jersey to pass further amendments. In 1972, he attempted to attach an amendment that would bar any kind of U.S. reentry into hostilities in Vietnam, Laos, or Cambodia without congressional authorization. And this amendment was attached to a State Department funding bill. It was defeated in May of 1972. It was reintroduced in January of 1973 and passed in June of 1973. Although U.S. troops were already withdrawn from Vietnam in late March of 1973, in accordance with the Paris Peace Agreement, bombing in Cambodia and Laos continued until the August 15, 1973 deadline set by the amendment. So what Church is most famous for, in addition to these anti-Vietnam War amendments, were his investigations into multinational corporations and the intelligence community. So in early 1972, columnist Jack Anderson published stories about the misdeeds of the International Telephone and Telegraph Company, also known as ITT. Allegedly, the Justice Department settled its antitrust suit against ITT in exchange for ITT's $400,000 contribution to the Republican National Convention. Later that month, Anderson published more stories accusing ITT of plotting with the CIA to block the election of Chile's President Salvador Allende in 1970. Allende threatened to nationalize ITT's 60% interest in the Chilean telephone company. Anderson also claimed that ITT's president, Harold Janine, offered the Nixon administration a contribution of, quote, up to 7 figures to keep Allende out of power. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee, of which Church was a member, sprung into action to open an investigation into ITT and other multinational corporations. This was largely backed by public opinion. Those Anderson stories were so shocking that they really turned public opinion against ITT and towards these investigations. The investigation was to last 2 to 3 years, and Church chaired this subcommittee. Church had long been an outspoken opponent of big business, and he operated and campaigned without corporate support. So he really had a moral high ground here and a mandate to investigate these multinational corporations. At this time, ITT operated telephone systems in over 120 countries, and they also controlled Avis Rental Car Company, Levitt & Sons Builders, Continental Baking, and Sheraton Hotels. And President Harold Janine really kind of touted their huge oligarchy, basically, and their colonialist enterprise. When former CIA Director Richard Helms was appointed ambassador to Iran, the subcommittee had a unique opportunity to question him on the ITT-CIA war against Allende. Senators Church, Case, and William Fulbright interrogated Helms, and another member of the subcommittee, Senator Stuart Symington, offered up William Breaux, who was the CIA head of clandestine services for Latin America, and he was the ITT liaison in 1970. Breaux was kind of the sacrifice that let Helms go on to be appointed ambassador to Iran. Breaux led to Harold Janine, ITT's CEO, and the committee revealed that collaboration between ITT and CIA occurred at the highest levels. Another investigation that the subcommittee pursued was oil multinationals, who were enjoying record profits as oil shortages loomed large and oil prices soared. Again, columnist Jack Anderson published shocking stories on the Arabian American Oil Company, also known as Aramco, colluding with Saudis to raise oil prices to cover up their upgrades to then neglected American oil fields. At the same time, they were also overpumping Saudi oil and causing pressure drops in Saudi Arabia's oil fields, which was endangering the supply. The investigation showed that Aramco lobbied for pro-Arab U.S. foreign policy to curry favor with the Saudi government, really acting as instruments of the Saudi government. Aramco even gave intelligence to the Saudi government detailing the quantity of oil provided to the U.S. military, which then allowed the Saudis to scale back production, giving them leverage over the military. So really collusion at the highest levels between multinational corporations and foreign interests, often at the expense of American interests. During these investigations, Church also had to seek re-election in the 1974 race, and these subcommittee investigations were actually a liability during his election campaign because he didn't have time to campaign, and also he was seen as ignoring the constituents in favor of pursuing these foreign policy interests. Despite this, and the growing opposition from right-wing groups like the John Birch Society, he still won 55% of the vote. After he won re-election in 1975, he really had what was called the Year of the Investigation. He was still pursuing the multinational subcommittee, as well as looking into the misdeeds of the intelligence community at home and abroad. So in 1975, the multinational subcommittee investigated Northrop and Lockheed for bribing governments to sell military planes and electrical hardware. The Nixon administration really encouraged this as a way to exert anti-communist influence in the Middle East without sending troops. The investigation into Lockheed spilled into other countries and implicated Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, the Italian government, and former Prime Minister Kakue Tanaka of Japan. So these investigations had wide-reaching ramifications abroad. Also, after the ITT investigation, Church wanted to go after the CIA and the FBI for their expanded powers. He really was concerned about the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover, and he actually called him creepy. But he was actually rebuffed in his efforts until an investigative article by Seymour Hersh came out, and it detailed the illegal intelligence operation by the CIA against thousands of Americans, especially anti-war activists. On January 27, 1975, by a vote of 82-4, a Senate Select Committee on Intelligence Activities was formed. This committee was tasked with investigating the CIA, FBI, and other intelligence gathering agencies. One of the first investigations was into political assassinations of foreign leaders. Although Democrats were worried that they would be tarnished by the actions of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations once these investigations came out, the committee pushed ahead. They uncovered Operation Mongoose, which was the plot to assassinate Fidel Castro and undermine the Cuban government, as well as a plot to murder Patrice Lumumba, the premier of the Belgian Congo. In other incidents, the CIA armed dissidents to overthrow their governments. These included Rafael Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, South Vietnam's Ngo Dinh Diem, and General Rene Schneider of Chile. Although they didn't really have conclusive proof, the committee did find evidence that the CIA might have also been involved in plots to murder Ahmed Sukarno of Indonesia and Francois Duvalier of Haiti. So after these private investigations, they held their first public hearing 9 months after the formation of the committee. And Church kind of caught the public's attention when he brandished a poison dart gun that was developed by the CIA that could be used to assassinate political enemies. So these photographs of Church with the gun really sparked attention towards the Church committee. But this quickly wavered after the committee got kind of bogged down in discussing chemical weapons for 3 days straight. So the committee kind of had trouble maintaining the public's attention on these investigations. Some other big discoveries by the committee, FBI's COINTELPRO, which undermined civil rights groups, a special unit in the IRS, which, quote, politically harassed political activists, and major communication companies such as the aforementioned ITT and RCA routinely provided the CIA access to telegrams that Americans sent abroad for over 30 years. The CIA also ran a 20-year mail intercept program, and it included a letter that Church mailed in 1971 to his mother-in-law in Boise. The committee also uncovered the efforts of the Nixon White House to use the FBI, CIA, NSA, and the Defense Intelligence Agency to mount a massive and highly illegal domestic surveillance campaign. Church used both the multinational committee and this intelligence committee to publicly question America's role in the world. He compared the U.S. to a drug addict hooked on the Cold War and imperialism. To feed its habit, it backed some of the world's most brutal dictatorships and created a security system that was more and more, quote, a mirror image of the evil it is designed to combat. So after these committees wrapped up, Church had a failed presidential run in 1976, and he really struggled to work with the Carter administration. Carter, who was a Washington outsider, he came in as a governor, and was really an outsider to the Senate and the House. He really didn't like Church and his over 2-decade Washington insider status. However, Church was still productive in the Senate. He met with Castro and convinced him to free several political prisoners. Also, Church worked hard on the ratification of the Torrijos-Carter treaties, which returned the Panama Canal to Panama. These foreign activities made him widely unpopular in Idaho, and it led to the formation of the ABC, Anybody But Church Committee, which supported Church's opponent in the 1980 Senate election, Steve Sims. Church lost the election by less than 1% of the vote. So something funny that happened during that election night, the news media called the state of Idaho for Reagan before polls closed in the Panhandle, which is in the Pacific time zone. So after polls closed in southern Idaho, which is in the Mountain time zone, they just pretty definitively called Idaho for Reagan, and this probably depressed turnout in the Panhandle, and that may have led to Church's loss. And it really was a close vote. After Church lost the 1980 Senate race, he went back to private law practice in Washington, D.C., but he quickly got ill. He had a pancreatic tumor, and he died in 1984. He laid in state in the Idaho Capitol building, and his funeral was televised all through Idaho, and he is now buried in a cemetery next to William Borah, his idol, in Boise. So I think he's an interesting character. He's a very powerful character, and I'm really surprised by how few people actually remember Church and how popular he was in Idaho, which is seen as this kind of impenetrable Republican stronghold. But I think the fact that he won 4 terms, he was actually fairly popular during his tenure, and he had the support of the people for most of his term in office, is really ignored and forgotten. And I think we can take the lessons of his first Senate race, where he heavily canvassed his state. He met people wherever they were. He drove through tiny towns, and he talked to farmers groups, church groups, just anyone he could get a hold of. And he wasn't afraid to talk to people and listen to their concerns. And I think that's something we can take into the future in Idaho. We have wildly popular progressive campaigns, such as the Reclaim Idaho Medicaid expansion campaign that won by a 2-to-1 margin. So I think as long as there are candidates who can speak to the issues that affect the small town Idahoan constituents, we can again have a Democrat in a statewide office in Idaho. So as always, the show notes will be on arsenalfordemocracy.com. And I want to thank you for listening and joining me on this journey into Idaho history.